And you're welcome back. Now we're going to have a look at our second case study, and we're joined by Orla Egan, queer archival archivist, founder of Cork LGBT Archive, documentary filmmaker, and author of Queer Republic of Cork. And there's a whole litany of other things I could put in there because she has such a long history in terms of LGBT activism in Ireland. Orla, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
We're going to look at the case of Donna McAnallen, who was somebody who was working in Cork back in the 90s, and they had an issue in terms of their employment after they were seen kissing their partner. Now, I'm going to let you fill in the details more, and then we can talk about it. So can you just give us what the circumstances were?
Okay, so Donna McAnallen is originally from Belfast, but lived in Cork in the 1990s. And she was employed by Brookfield Leisure Centre in Cork from September 1992 and employed as a lifeguard and a fitness instructor. And she was dismissed in April 1993 for allegedly kissing her girlfriend in the changing rooms of the leisure centre. And it seems that a complaint was made by a member of the leisure centre that she had been seen kissing her girlfriend, and management responded by dismissing Donna on the spot. So in June 1993, Donna took a case to the Labour Court, and she was supported in her case by solicitors Noonan and Linehan. And basically, before the Labour Court, she claims that her dismissal constituted a contravention of the 1977 Employment Equality Act. So she took the case to the Labour Court, and it was heard in October 1993. So she's basically saying that she was dismissed because of her sexual orientation, because of an alleged complaint about an alleged incident, and that basically if a man or a straight person had engaged in the same incident, had kissed their girlfriend, that they wouldn't have been dismissed. So basically, in the court case, the kinds of points that they were putting forward was that she was discriminated against in circumstances where a male person doing exactly the same action as she did would not have been dismissed. So if a man had been allegedly kissing his girlfriend in the changing room or anywhere on the premises, that he wouldn't have been dismissed for that action. And then the second point that they made was that the Employment Equality Act at the time prohibited sexual harassment, and that under the European Commission Code of Practice on Sexual Harassment, it recognized that discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation must be seen as sexual harassment. And then the third point that they made was that the worker's sexual orientation, her lesbianism, was a characteristic unique to the female sex, and that actions based on that characteristic must constitute direct discrimination on the grounds of sex, and therefore should be covered by the Employment Equality Act that outlawed discrimination on the basis of sex. So that was the case that she put forward to the Labour Court, and obviously Brookfield Leisure Centre said that's not the case. And the judgment in this case was really interesting because they both found for her and against her. So they did find that she had been summarily dismissed, just dismissed on the spot, because of a complaint by a client of the employer that the worker acted in a way in the course of her employment as to cause offence and to demonstrate her sexual orientation. So I'm not sure if they're saying there that just demonstrating the fact that you're lesbian or gay was an offence in and of itself, or if the offence was the kissing. So basically the Labour Court found that she had been treated unfairly, and that they were satisfied that she had been treated in an arbitrary and unfair manner, and that she was given no opportunity to respond to the complaint that had been made, no opportunity to, if the incident had happened, to alter her behaviour. And even if she had done what she was, accused of doing, the court said that wasn't so serious a matter as to justify immediate dismissal. So they said at the very least, even if it had happened, she should have been given an opportunity as well to kind of change her behavior to a manner deemed more acceptable in the employment. So in that sense, they did say that, you know, her dismissal was unfair and arbitrary and shouldn't have happened. But what they also found was that it wasn't covered by the employment equality legislation as it existed at that time. So we're talking about early 1990s. So what was in force at that point was the 1977 Employment Equality Act, which just dealt with you know, gender and sex discrimination and didn't have the kind of range of areas that are now covered by employment and equality legislation in Ireland. So the court found that the unfair manner in which she was treated did not amount to discrimination within the meaning of the Employment Equality Act. They were satisfied that the unfair treatment did not arise from any attribute of her sex, but of her sexual orientation, and that in all probability, a man would have suffered the same discrimination for a similar display of his sexual orientation. So it's kind of this bizarre argument that basically, if a gay man had kissed his partner, he probably would have been dismissed as well. So therefore, it wasn't sex discrimination. And so it's like, you know, even though I think that that she made and her solicitors made a very valid argument that you could interpret the discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation as being sex discrimination, the court found that you couldn't. So they basically said that it wasn't covered by the employment equality legislation because sexual orientation wasn't included in the Act. But what that did do is that it strengthened the argument for the inclusion, explicit inclusion of sexual orientation under the new employment equality legislation that was being discussed and planned at the time. And there had been a campaign building for some time, had been advocating for the inclusion of sexual orientation explicitly in the legislation, a campaign that was kind of being led by various LGBT organizations and trade unions and other social change organizations. So that campaign had been building anyway. So I think that Donna McAnallen's case strengthened the argument for why we needed explicit inclusion of sexual orientation in the legislation. And the Minister for Equality and Law Reform at the time, Mervyn Taylor, he indicated that he would be publishing a bill which would outlaw discrimination such as that suffered by Donna McAnallen. So he was referring directly to the case following the judgment. And then in the 1998 Employment Equality Act, sexual orientation was included as one of the protected grounds. So I think this is a really important case for us to be highlighting, because I think it did play a really, really strong part in bringing about that really important legislative change of having sexual orientation explicitly mentioned in both the Employment Equality Act and the Equal Status Act. And there was a lot of, you know, publicity around the Act at the time. There was a lot of media coverage, but it was also raised in the European Parliament by the Irish MEP Mary Benatti. So there was a kind of debate going on around the Civil Liberties Committee's report that was recommending stronger protection for human rights and equal treatment of all, irrespective of nationality, religion, colour, sex, sexual orientation, and other difference. So Mary Benatti directly raised Donna McAnallen's case in the European Parliament in February 1994. And she said it was a very disturbing case, and that as long as EU and national laws were weak, then discrimination could rear its ugly head. And she said that we still have a long way to go in terms of legislation in Ireland and other EU countries to ensure that overt discrimination does not take place in the workplace and everywhere else. And the bit about the story that I like and that I was involved in was the Cork LGBT community, and particularly the lesbian community, rallied to support Donna McAnallen. And, you know, we organised protests at the Brookfield Leisure Centre, and we had T-shirts. So we all went up there wearing T-shirts going, I wished I had kissed Donna McAnallen. So I think it was a very, positive and very Cork and humorous way to respond to the case and to show our support. And like I said, there was a lot of publicity about the case, and there was an editorial in the Cork Examiner in February 1994, and it said at least one positive outcome, which may be of small consolation to the woman involved, is that the publicity and international attention given to the case makes a repetition unlikely. So I think, there were a number of positive outcomes, but obviously in the case, Donna still lost her job, and and also lost the Labour Court case.
There's two things I think to mark for people to understand about this case, and that is that when this happened in 1993, the laws criminalising homosexuality in Ireland were still on the statute. Like they hadn't been reformed at that stage. So that was one thing. And the second thing I think that's very important to understand is that Donna wasn't an activist, in the sense that she didn't go out looking for this. She found herself thrust into this situation and having to deal with it, and then finding, for anybody, given the amount of publicity that was generating around it at the time, and given the culture and societal issues that there were around identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or trans in those days, could be really difficult. So we lived a generation where these were real dangers to us in terms of our family lives and our careers and things like that. So for her to go forward and take the case, I think it's a huge statement about her character, that she was not prepared to let this go and that she was willing to stand up for it. And then, of course, also, we can never forget just how brilliant, in particular, the lesbian community is down in Cork. I've had years of experience of seeing the activism and the work and the solidarity that exists within the lesbian community in Cork, which is quite incredible. And the community came together on it as well. I think that was hugely significant. And then, as you rightly point out, this case helped to inform what would then follow down the line in terms of employment equality legislation, which is what we'll be kind of dealing with in the next case study that we look at. But the old gremlins of Irish society creeped into that to some degree. So we'll talk about that in more detail. You're still in contact with Donna. Is life going well for her?
Yeah, I mean, Donna's living in the UK now, so she's not in Cork anymore. But I think, you're very right. I think it's such a testament to her character, because it did take strength at that time to not just take a case, but she took a case very publicly. She had herself named. She did a lot of media coverage around it. So she was very public and open about the case that was happening. And I think that was, not everybody would be in a position where they could do that. But again, of course, I agree with you that the Cork lesbian community in the 1980s and 1990s was, real sense of community there. And I think, even that about the type of protest that was organized, it was funny, it was in your face, but it was making the point as well, so, she was held by the community in terms of the support for taking the case. And I think as well, it's something I've said on lots of occasions, but I think we tend towards a very, narrow narrative of our history often, so, we've heard about one or two kind of high profile cases, but I think there are lots of other cases like Donna's case that we don't highlight very often, and that aren't part of our narrative of how legislative change happened in Ireland. So I think it's really important to see that. And I think that, arguments were being made that there was no need to explicitly include sexual orientation in employment legislation. And I think Donna's case very clearly showed why there was a need for that, because the court very clearly found that she had been unfairly treated. She had been unfairly dismissed, but there was no legislative framework that they saw to offer her any recourse about that. So it made the case so clearly that the law needed to change. And I think the other thing about it is, he talked about, criminalization still being enforced, that we didn't have decriminalization yet. I mean, lesbians weren't included explicitly in that legislation. So the kind of the laws that criminalized, gay sex didn't explicitly include lesbians, but it created a culture that impacted on lesbians, even if we weren't explicitly included in it. So it created that like culture of fear for people about being out in their workplaces and the consequences of that. And again, I think Donna's case shows that, and it was also, it was like that it was taken so seriously that a member of the leisure centre could just go to management and say they saw this horrendous incident of a woman kissing another woman, allegedly. And that the response to that is get rid of her instantly. That's the kind of society we're living in,
I mean, you mentioned the history side of it, and yourself being an archivist and doing so much work in terms of research and publishing it and all that for people. Because I want to remind people that your book, Queer Republic of Cork, is available. There's a link going to be on the landing page for this series of webcasts that people can follow in order to be able to get a copy of it. But I think one of the things you touched on there is absolutely correct. One of the things that we have lost out in a lot of ways in our community history is the visibility, in particular, of lesbians, and a lot of the issues that were happening to lesbians. That even though the law didn't specifically criminalise it, you're right, it had a chilling effect. It was one of the things that we fought to have included in the motion that was passed in the Oireachtas prior to the state apology in 2018, that it although the laws were specific, they had this knock-on effect. And I know one of the things that was very big for a lot of lesbians who perhaps had married and came out later in life and had children was the fear that under our court system, in the family courts, most often if the husband was to raise an issue about the lesbianism of their wife, or former wife, that they would lose custody or access to their children in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
and we forget about that.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have another Cork case that involved another Cork lesbian, Tony Burgess, who was one of the first Irish lesbians to successfully get her kids back. So when she separated from her husband at the time, she lost custody of her children solely because she was lesbian. And she fought that case and she succeeded in getting the kids back. But it took time and obvious heartache and,
absolutely
impact on everybody in that family. And, I mean, I know I'm always going on about Cork is fabulous. And it's one of the reasons that I created the Cork LGBT Archive is to highlight, that history and to move us away from that Dublin-centric focus or that focus on the lives of one or two gay men and that kind of naive assumption that all the change happens because of a small few people. I mean, I think it does build on decades of activism. And just the last thing I wanted to say was just around that, that whole campaign around getting the trade unions actively involved in supporting the campaigns for LGBT workers' rights, but also for decriminalisation. A lot of that started in Cork with the 1981 National Gay Conference, posters just behind me here, in 1981. And one of the motions there was around trying to campaign for trade unions to support those campaigns. And in 1982, Kieran Rose was one of the people getting one of the first motions passed at a trade union to support those campaigns. And then that built to the place where we have had very strong trade union support for those changes.
Look, I mean, I know you and I could go on talking here for ages and ages and ages about all this stuff, because I have an affinity with Cork from many years of going down to it, being an LGBT activist myself and that. So listen, Orla, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on and so brilliantly explaining the case and the wonderful culture and history that is Cork, the LGBT community in Cork, and particularly the lesbian community there. Listen, have a great Pride, enjoy yourself, and all the best to everybody down there.
Thank you. Take care.